Thank you very much. I think what we'll do is it's a small group, so we'll open it up to a discussion a bit early in the 45 minutes, because it works quite well in a small group to make it more discursive than me dominate with questions for that length of time. So you'll have plenty of time to join in. We'll make it as conversational as possible. But Shami, what I'd like to do for the first few minutes anyway is look in very general terms about your philosophy in terms of the job, because I come to the same issue from a very different perspective, I suppose, of speaking to politicians about some of the issues that you deal with. And I suppose it's a statement of the obvious, but I'll state it anyway. From Blair to Cameron downwards, I never meet anyone who would claim other than to be a liberal on the issues that you deal with. So the only area of contention is how liberal can we be whilst maintaining security and protection and so on. And the debate is around that balance. And I wonder, sometimes they convey a certainty that they're right. You have to convey a certainty that you're right. Why are you sort of sure of your argument if the area is that rather grey one about what is practically necessary? In other words, I've never met a politician who says, look, one of the reasons I'm in power is because I want, for various reasons, in Britain I haven't anyway, I want to deprive people of their liberty. I mean, it would be absurd for them to say that, but I don't think they even think it. It's just not part of their repertoire of ambitions to deliberately and unnecessarily curtail liberty. So I wonder whether in Britain, anyway, not elsewhere, but in Britain, we get too unnecessarily alarmed about this area.
Oh goodness me, well to answer your last question first, we don't get unnecessarily alarmed. If anything, the greatest danger in a country like Britain, arguably the oldest unbroken democracy on earth, is because we've been so fortunate for so long. The danger is complacency.
Right.
That's, in a sense, my biggest fear. I don't pretend for a moment, Steve, that this is Burma or Zimbabwe or Pakistan or so many places. So in a way, my job as a human rights campaigner in Britain it's a privilege, isn't it? Nobody's putting me under house arrest. I've criticised prime ministers and senior judges and editors of all persuasions, and I've been allowed to go on TV and do it, and I've been rewarded. I've been given a CBE for it. I mean, it's almost ludicrous. That would be the way that if I were you, that's what I would put, and I would say yes, except that this is so precious. To live in a liberal democracy is so precious, and Britain's potential role in being a model of liberal democracy to the world is so important that complacency is the biggest danger, because the danger is that you've been so fortunate for so long that you don't remember in living memory what it might be like to have compromised too much privacy, too much free speech, and so it goes. Now, to go to your earlier point, which is, well, the politicians are all good people. They broadly are. I mean, I'm not someone who subscribes to the view that they're all wicked and they all went into it to make loads of money. But here's
to add another, they are all basically good people. I don't detect in any of them an instinctive
authoritarian instinct. Well, that's where we will differ, right. I'm afraid, because I do think that I mean, in a sense, we can bandy about labels like liberal and authoritarian, but I would say that across the parties, and particularly the two major parties, the parties tend to be defined, not just in British, but in European, possibly to some extent world politics. What makes you left or right of centre has traditionally, for many years, been about your approach to the economy.
Yeah,
how much intervention should there be in the economy? Small state, big state, high tax, low tax, has broadly defined whether you're right and left. And yet there is this other axis, which is a more liberal authoritarian axis. And what we find at Liberty is that if you take the two major parties, I know the Lib Dems have had this moment, and it's not for me to see what happens next. But in terms of the Labour and Conservative parties, we find when we do polling on our issues, your approach to identity cards, to locking people up without charge or trial, etc., the party faithful are split down the middle. Now that doesn't mean that some are good and some are bad. It does mean that there is a different axis, it's a different debate. And it's a debate, I put it no higher than that. Now what I would say is that democracy is not just about having elections every few years and whoever wins the popularity contest then having a blank check to govern completely without fetter until the next election. That is not democracy. And in particular, since World War II, great democracies all over the world have understood that for democracy to thrive and to survive, it needs checks and balances. And the checks and balances that I stand for and that my organisation works for are in particular a small bundle of non-negotiable rights and freedoms. You can debate their application, but you shouldn't debate whether privacy is important, free speech is important, fair trials are important. You can debate what they mean in any given context, but you need some fundamental rights and freedoms that people sign up to in principle, and you need the rule of law. And it's not just the winner takes all. I've won the election, I'm a good person, I call myself a liberal, therefore anything that I say is necessary to deal with terrorism is by definition because I won the and then the final point I would make is this, that people can feel that they are doing their best with all the pressures that they are subject to. I worked in government, the most formative part of my career was working in the Home Office, including on anti-terror measures, and I've seen Home Secretaries dealing with this, and something terrible happens. It's not their fault. Something terrible happens in a democracy. It doesn't have to be terrorism. It could be a bomb that goes off. It could be a small child that is murdered. It could be all sorts of things that happen, things that you don't write about in your manifesto, things that are not to do with small state, big state tax and spend, just things that test you. And the cry goes up from the public and the media, and it's Home Secretary, Prime Minister, what are you going to do to make sure that this never ever happens again? And the understandable human instinct and popular political instinct is to have an answer to that, which isn't always a carefully calibrated answer. And so it's not just about are we being liberal or are we being authoritarian. There's a more detailed framework of values that can help in policy analysis. So for example, the rule against torture, in my view, is rightly an absolute rule against torture, even in extremis, even in time of war or public emergency. That's what the drafters of the Human Rights Conventions after World War II agreed. The right to privacy, on the other hand, is a more balanced right. It's incredibly important. You can't have intimacy, dignity, trust without it. In some circumstances you can't have free speech without it. Sometimes you need the anonymity to have the free speech, but it's not an absolute, and therefore it's subject to different tests like, is this in accordance with the law, is it proportionate? So rather than just me saying I'm a liberal and I'm more liberal than David Cameron and therefore I disagree with him, I subject his policy statements to a slightly more detailed, rigorous scrutiny based on what is the right that's being engaged, what is the evil that he says he's addressing, is this in compliance with principle that's been agreed by Democrats all over the world since World War II.
But even some of those examples that you give can be quite subjective. I think there are areas where it clearly isn't subjective, where you can tell something pretty extreme is going on in Britain. And when that happens, it tends to be stopped very quickly. You're going to accuse me of complacency, but when Blair preposterously agreed without a second's thought to have the 90-day arrest without, being held without arrest.
Without charge.
Without trial. It was defeated in the Commons. It didn't get anywhere. When Brown tried to do the same trick on 45 days.
But not without a lot of work, I can tell you.
No, I know you put a lot of work into it, but on the whole, those things tend to be stopped. And yet you read weekly, in a way I'm sure you would agree, from Henry Porter in The Observer and one or two others, you know, anyone would think Britain was governed by a whole group of people instinctively authoritarian.
You know.
And I mean, no one stopped him writing in the same way you've been awarded an honour for your thing. And so I'm just trying to measure how serious.
Hyperbole is always the danger, and you know, perhaps
As much as complacency? No, you would say, I'm sure.
Well, I
Because that's the other
wouldn't
side.
say. I'd say it's different. I mean, complacency is a big danger because it can just stop you caring, and then you miss really bad things. But hyperbole is counterproductive. Hyperbole is you are worried. You know, I'm not a journalist, so for me, I'm trying to. You know, it's my job to stop bad things happening, not to write good copy. So there's a different.
Sure.
I'm not trying to. You know, Henry's done great work. Everybody serves in their different way.
Yeah.
And so for me, the danger of hyperbole is if it's ineffective, and you start turning off people who might actually be receptive to your reasonable message. So that's the danger of hyperbole. The danger of complacency is you wake up one day and you've sold the past on so many things that were actually quite precious. But of course Britain isn't a police state, and of course if one reaches for certain words too often, you're like the boy who cried wolf.
Yeah.
You know, Orwellian is a wonderful adjective that can be misused. You know, Stalin, you know, all sorts of, and the danger there is that people are turned off. But nonetheless, that's just about being an ineffective advocate.
Yeah.
You know, nonetheless, I do think that you are too glib about the 90 days and the 42 days, because when 90 days didn't pass, you know, what passed instead was 28 days, which was still too long. And by the way, it was detention without charge. It's the equivalent of being arrested in the street or in a dawn raid and taken to a police cell and not being told why for 28. Imagine what that would feel like. You know, we have a very decent criminal justice system that's been modelled on the basis that you arrest on reasonable suspicion, which may not be very much, but very quickly, within hours or a few days, you are charged on the basis of evidence, and then much later, in a complex trial, it could be a year or two later, you are convicted on the basis of proof. And that's really quite important. And to be arrested on reasonable suspicion and then banged up for 6 weeks and not know the offence that you're being charged with, just to know you've been arrested for terrorism, is terrifying. I mean, there's a lot of nonsense that's spoken about human rights and the Human Rights Act, which I think is one of the, you know, the best legacies of the last government. You know, every government has a mixed record,
Has a mixed bag,
right?
yeah.
But and I would say that some of the best things about the last government were, particularly in its early days, the creation of certain architecture which provided safeguards that then the government might have resented itself. But that's what you do in a democracy. You create architecture that
present your own
exactly, and then you get. You know, but so we did Human Rights Act, Equality Act, various, you know, and then if I were to be critical of the Blair-Brown years, they then sometimes dishonoured their own architecture with some of the other policies. But nonetheless, you know, people talk nonsense about the Human Rights Act. It's a carefully calibrated framework of rights and freedoms that is about liberty and security. But I mean, the crucial principles are the idea that every individual is precious. That you can't just say, if we're protecting the many, we can do anything to the few, which I think people would understand is a pretty big thing to say. So each and every individual human life is precious. We call it dignity, the idea of human dignity. Secondly, the principle of equal treatment under the law, which is phenomenally important. Why? Because when we're making these subjective, and you're right, they can be subjective balancing acts, how much free speech, how much privacy, how much freedom of association can or cannot be interfered with in the name of whatever it is, security, the economic well-being of the country. It is so easy in a democracy for a majority to say, we will have our free speech, but the minority won't. We will have our privacy, but the minority won't. So the great value of the principle of equal treatment is it forces a democratic majority to take the pain itself. And when it's deciding whether ID cards are a good idea or speech offences are a good idea, it has to do it on the basis that it will be somebody like me who could be on the rough end of the stick and not just.
Do you think also, I mean, it's interesting, in some of the campaigns you fought, you've been allied with people like David Davis, the former Shadow Home Secretary who resigned, who's on the right of the Conservative Party. And his view on civil liberties, though utterly sincere and expressed with total conviction, is part of a broader political philosophy, which is that the state really is a pretty malevolent force in all its manifestations. He would argue for much less public spending, tax cuts. He basically wants freedom of the individual in most parts of life, whereas some would say that the state can be a progressive force that helps bring about equality and all the rest of it. So
where I would disagree with him.
Yeah. So
basically, I agree with him that that privacy matters, that free speech matters, that that we have to have checks against abuse of state power. Where he and I would disagree is perhaps that he wouldn't be so worried about abuses of other power.
Yeah.
Basically, an abuse of power is an abuse of power, and particularly in the modern world, power can be abused by something that is formally called the state or something that's formally called News International. If you're experiencing that degradation or that intrusion and you're an individual citizen, you don't really care whether your phone was hacked necessarily by the spooks or by News International. You just want to know who's going to protect you. So you want a system of checks and balances which protects the vulnerable from the powerful, whoever. And frankly, this state non-state thing doesn't even work in a world of contracting out when, you know, vulnerable elderly people are being cared for in residential care homes that are private. So and not, you know, so that would be one difference
sort
between.
Of find yourself.
No, I just think that he
in dancing with the libertarian right.
Well, the point is that I've never been afraid of being just honest with people. I'm perfectly happy, and my organisation is to make common cause with people on particular issues.
Sure.
But we will not. I mean, David Davis, for example, would speak against the Human Rights Act, which I say is a nonsense. Because how does he think we held Mr. Blair's government to account in the courts? He has ridiculous. He takes. You know, don't get me wrong, David Davis and I have made common cause, and he's made common cause with liberty, but his position on prisoner voting, for example, the idea that if a single prisoner gets to vote, this will bring down parliamentary democracy because this is an imposition from the European Court of Human Rights, it's frankly last of the summer wine. It's him and Jack Straw having saying, look at me, look at me. The bottom line is the blanket ban on prisoners voting was passed in the Victorian age, and there hadn't been a modern parliamentary debate about it. And I'm all for having that debate. I personally would let every prisoner vote, just like I let them all read books and have decent meals. I say, if you're going to interfere with them, have a justification. You lock them up to keep the public safe, but how do you keep the public safe? By depriving them? That's a debate to be had. But my biggest concern, it's not David in particular, but the idea of a sort of libertarian, non-human rights perspective. What's the difference between people that will happily talk about civil liberties but never talk about human rights? What is that about? In my view, what that's about is civil liberties is sometimes used as a euphemism for citizens' liberties, and human rights deliver what they say on the tin. It's rights for all human beings, and that to me has always been the biggest fault line in this coalition on whatever it is, 90 days. It's would you fight for the asylum seeker in the way that you would fight for the citizen? Not in terms of whether they have a right to particular benefits, but in terms of whether they have basic fundamental human rights to be treated with dignity and fairness. And that's sometimes where the fault line emerges.
Okay, let's have a look at the sort of individuals. We've had the sort of exploration of ideas and the sort of debate within what it is to be a liberal and a supporter of liberty in these quite complex times. Let's have a look at the people you were dealing with. You mentioned, let's start with the Labour government, then we'll move on to the coalition. You mentioned early on you detected, from your perspective, good intentions from Labour, the Human Rights Act, and probably one or two other things. If you are right that they were well-intentioned at the beginning, what do you think went wrong? Because, as I say, if Blair was sitting here, he would claim he was basically a liberal, he was a sort of left-of-centre liberal lawyer. Charles Clarke, when he was Home Secretary, said that much more analysis needs to be done on what it is to be a liberal post-September the 11th. He claimed to be a liberal Home Secretary.
Well,
what's your assessment of that crowd?
I don't think that, well, you know, the word liberal is a word, and I don't claim to own it. But in my view...
they weren't.
They didn't... I think that if you look at this fault line that I described, if you look at people's instincts, I think that they were more... It doesn't make you a wicked person, but it just means that you have certain... You know, if we just assume that people are of good faith and that people are, for a moment, trying to address real problems in good faith, people nonetheless have instincts. And I think that both Mr. Blair and most of the people that served in his government had more naturally authoritarian instincts when it came to dealing with difficult problems. It doesn't make them bad people. It just lends itself, I'm afraid, to 90 days and 42 days and identity cards and stop and search without suspicion. That's all I'm saying. I give them credit, though, for setting up certain architecture at the beginning of their government. I think part of the problem was that, you know, when you're an optimistic opposition, potentially planning a possible coalition with the Liberal Democrats, you can develop a certain interest in constitutional reform and devolution and the Human Rights Act and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, you then also say, I'm going to be tough on crime, I'm going to be tough on immigration, and you will inevitably create a tension between your constitutional policy and your home affairs policy. And it didn't begin with Mr. Blair, it began actually with Mr. Howard. Tony Blair and Michael Howard are the two sort of great modern British politicians who really, to my mind, accelerated an authoritarian arms race in British politics. It's interesting that they both did the Home Affairs brief and then went on to lead their parties. And I think that they played a part in a way in goading each other and their parties down a particular path, which, if you continued down it too far, would not end well. Then, of course, the catalyst of 9/11, which challenged people all over the world, both sides of the Atlantic and elsewhere, and puts enormous pressures on any democratic government. And you've got a recipe for 90 days and so on.
Do you think, post-September the 11th, Blair and others misread the scale and nature of the threat in Britain? Or just were authoritarian of instinct, where you clearly think they were anyway, and almost use that as an excuse to
I think that they
put into practice their authoritarian
I think they had.
instincts?
I mean, you can even, you know, I worked in the Home Office from 1996 to 2001, so I worked under the last year of the Howard Home Office, and then the Jack Straw Home Office before 9/11. I actually was at Liberty by 9/11, so I've seen that there was actually quite a lot of authoritarian
pre-September
legislation pre-September the 11th. But September the 11th was a catalyst. It's not for me. I've never really predicated any of my arguments on the basis of the scale of the threat. Not least because secret intelligence is the preserve of governments rather than spectators. I just think it was the wrong response. I think you can accept that 9/11 was a horrific moment and a terrifying moment and a moment of enormous scale. It's for other people to, with the span of history, say, is it equivalent to World War II or not? But what I do think is that the responses weren't just disproportionate, they were worse, they were counterproductive. And it's the counterproductivity of saying the rules of the game have changed and now I'm going to shut down free speech and shut down fair trials. Because at the end of the day, if you do buy into, you know, if you do buy into the part of the Tony Blair thesis, which is there are people out there who just don't respect our open society, who just have a different ideology and they just don't see it the way we do. Why would you undermine your open society and your fundamental beliefs in respect? Why would you pull the rug from under you? And that's always been, you know, that in the end, I believe that most people on earth want relatively similar things. for themselves and their families. Despite all the cultural and religious and geographical differences, people do want to be treated with dignity, they do want equal treatment, they do want basic fairness. And I believe that these basic rights and freedoms are universal, and they don't, you know, and they should belong to everyone. So why would you undermine that when that is your biggest currency in engaging with the world?
And what about, I mean, to some extent, Cameron defined himself in opposition by voting against 90 days and then the Brown version. Some would say that was quite a brave thing to do. My guess is it was done, and I think this is Davis's view, it was done, they made the calculation of what would be best in terms of positioning and decided it was to oppose rather than support. But they did face the hostility of the Murdoch newspapers in doing that. Do you think, from your perspective, they are more liberal than the Labour regime, Cameron and Osborne and co?
I think you know, I don't make windows into men's souls, really. I mean, it's all very well.
In policy terms,
what I would say in policy terms is this: what I would say that the coalition parties were flung together 2 years ago by a combination of parliamentary arithmetic, the you know, financial markets, and just gravity, you know, political gravity, which is, you know, out with the old and in with the new. And even if the arithmetic had been different, maybe it's easier for the Lib Dems to, you know, to build a new government. But the noble glue, initially, if you look back to statements that were made right at the beginning, the noble glue that bound that coalition together, that made it a little bit more comfortable for, you know, people like Simon Hughes and David Davis to be going through lobbies together, was actually civil liberties.
Yeah, no question.
So the, you know, the practice that they'd had of going through lobbies together was on things like identity cards and 42 days and whatever. So that was the noblest thing, to bind people who otherwise on socio-economic policy would be miles apart. So if you go back to the initial coalition agreements, there's lots of talk about, you know, and I'm not saying that wasn't completely sincere, but I am saying that 2 years on, I have two observations. One is that we now have two incredibly authoritarian parties policies that are actually, in a way, beyond anything that the last government did. The first is the secret courts proposal that is, it's called the Justice and Security Bill, because this is worthy of Orwell. The most authoritarian measures always have, you know, wonderful titles. So, you know, the shut down open justice bill is actually called the Justice and Security Bill, you know. If there were, you know, it's kind of the Ministry of Truth type thing. So that's the first thing, and that's going through the House of Lords at the moment. And poor old Ken Clarke, you know, the instinctively liberal Justice Secretary is doing this. And what this means is that this is in response to litigation about extraordinary rendition during the War on Terror. And what this will mean in the future is that if anybody's suing the government, and it could be MI5, MI6, the MAD and whatever, in a case that raises national security issues, the government will be able to kick the claimant, their lawyers, the press, the public out of court, and the whole thing will be held in secret with what's called closed material proceedings, where the government lawyer has a private chat with the judge, gets to rely on secret intelligence that will never be challenged, and there's this hapless person called a special advocate who's appointed by the Attorney General but can't talk to the claimant to take instruction. And indeed, outrageous. And you should be a member of Liberty, so and that is now remember, this is a sort of formulation that was originally developed in a very limited class of cases to deport terror suspects or in control of. Now this is going to apply across the civil justice system. So that's policy number one. The second one is the blanket retention of communications data, which means your web browsing and your emails and so on. And the idea is, and there's a debate to be had here. The idea is that, you know, people who are up to no good pursuing criminality, criminal conspiracies, will always go and look for an unwatched space to do their wickedness. Or if they think they're being watched in this room, they'll go and have a walk in a park. And does that mean that every inch of every park should be watched? That's the kind of philosophical debate you want to have. But anyway, so the argument goes that because everybody knows that their telephones are being potentially listened to, now they're going to go on Skype, or they're going to go into chat rooms, or they're going to play games online, and they'll find ways to communicate with each other. And we should not allow any unwatched space. And what we need to do...
Is that bit of it true? I mean, from their perspective, because it is interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Everyone in opposition is against all these things, as the Conservatives were. They go in, and the Home Office, probably in your view, captures the incoming Home Secretary. But the Home Secretary can surely think for her or himself, and she has decided in this case that it's necessary, presumably because this thing is going on.
Well,
I don't know.
I have no doubt that if we all lived in a panopticon and there were no privacy, that you could probably catch some people that you wouldn't But let me put it this way. I know, as not just as a human rights lawyer, but as a feminist, that a lot of really bad crime happens in people's homes, right? And I'm talking violent crime and sex crime happens in people's homes, in their living rooms, in their bedrooms, and some of it may go undetected for years for all sorts of reasons, people not coming forward, etc., etc. So I could say, couldn't I, as a feminist Home Secretary, why don't we now change the law of the land and change the architecture of domestic dwellings so that there will be hidden microphones and cameras in every living room and every bedroom in the land. And then I could say, to use the analogy with this Snoopers Charter, as we call it, but don't worry, we will set up safeguards so that we will only look at the cameras and listen to the recordings if something else happens afterwards to make you a suspect. How would that go down?
Yeah, no, that's
and I'm just saying, particularly when you talk to young people, and there are younger people here who probably spend more of their intimate lives online than older people, you know, forming relationships, forming political alliances, taking health advice, all sorts of things that we would consider, you know, things that we didn't, when we were young, do online. We did by speaking to people. They know just how private your internet life is, and they are far more horrified. And they don't buy this nothing to hide, nothing to fear. And I tell you what, you know, when you see poor old Prime Minister and other people being cross-examined on their text messages at the Leveson Inquiry, I think a lot of people should reflect on whether it's really true that the innocent have nothing to hide.
I didn't know texts were saved somewhere. Where where are they kept?
Well, I have an iPhone. I don't know if anybody has an iPhone, but if you look at your text, if you look at the text message history that you have with a particular person, and you scroll up and you think, oh, I know there were more before that, and then there'll be a little message at the top saying you can download more of the earlier text. Well,
so they must be somewhere. Finally, could I ask you, and then we'll open it up for a broader discussion. You're I think the word is advisor at the Leveson Committee, the committee reviewing, the judge reviewing the future of newspapers and the media. Now, there are some journalists, not me, my worry is the other extreme, that he will be scared to recommend what is necessary. But as you know, a lot of journalists, and we were talking about this briefly before the meeting, are worried that actually you are taking part in something which is going to, in the end, involve a more draconian form of censorship of the newspapers that anyone associated with liberty should be involved with. What do you say to that concern? It's not one that I share.
Well, I would say that I wouldn't have got mixed up in this if I thought that's what I was doing. You know, just as after I've described the danger, haven't I? After a murder, after a terrorist atrocity, in a liberal democracy, there's always the danger that a perfectly decent human politician goes for the knee-jerk and wants to lock everybody up without charge or trial. And of course, after the phone hacking scandal, and particularly the Millie Dowler moment of last summer, there might well have been a danger of something that really was chilling to a free press. I think I've said this before, it's a little ironic that politicians of all persuasions get irritated by legal aid, trials, lawyers, judges, but when they find themselves in hot water, let's call a judge and let's have a public inquiry. But they do that, why? Because there is still some public trust for the independent judiciary in this country. And I, you know, with the support of my organisation, agreed to do this because I believe in free speech, but I believe that it's so important that after the events of last summer, there needs to be some trust and confidence rebuilt. You know, I say, you know, we've all had a go at the bankers, haven't we? You know, for goodness me, all over the world there are people telling banker jokes, and worse, except that we do need banks. We can't have an economy without some kind of banking system. After MPs' expenses, goodness me, there were lots of MPs that felt they couldn't go into a supermarket anymore without being vilified, and yet we believe in parliamentary democracy, so we can't throw MPs out of the window, and it goes on. And I would say to these journalists who are you know, what goes around, you know, they're now feeling the sensitivity that perhaps other people have felt under their spotlight sometimes. It's an understandable anxiety, but I would say to them, if you really believe in preserving a vibrant free press in Britain, engage positively with this, because you want to, you know, you want trust and confidence to be rebuilt, and that's why I've decided to play my part. And if it was anything to do with censorship, or state regulation of the press or anything like that, you know, I wouldn't have got involved.
Have you been, without going into any specifics, have you been, let me tell you, I have. I watched this inquiry, know some of the journalists and stuff. I've been quite shocked by some of the things that have come out. Are you allowed to even say whether... I
haven't been that. I mean, you know, shocked. You know, is it possible to be shocked and not surprised? I don't know. I think that I think a public inquiry has, in a sense, sort of two roles to play. One is just kind of truth and reconciliation. Let ordinary people, and the beauty of the Leveson Inquiry is that the judge agreed to have it all live streamed on the internet.
Yeah, that's really good.
So it's not just about, you know, what spin anybody puts on it and how it's written up in the newspapers. Anybody that wants to can go online and they can just watch for themselves and form their own view of whoever it is, a politician, a police officer. And I think that sometimes you have to go through that kind of process of transparency, which I hope the press would welcome.
Yeah.
And then the second part of any public inquiry is recommendations about what should happen in the future. And that's what will come hopefully in the autumn.
Yeah. So it ends this summer, then you all go away and he'll have to in the end write it up after discussing.
I think he's, you know, he's been clear that he hopes, you know, to have dealt with sort of formal evidence by the summer and then report. It's pretty good really, just over a year when you think about inquiries that have gone on for years and years and years.
Yeah. He's starting to look a bit fed up with it all. Is that...
Look, I mean, it's not for me to say, you know, we all have good and bad days at the office. It's a high pressure, high profile thing. I just would urge everybody to engage, because what I do know is that there is no agenda, there is no policy, there is no that has been written, and but I say this all the time, you know, to journalists and editors who passionately believe in the importance of their role, and they should. You know, positive engagement with this is the way forward.
Yeah, it's very important that he gets it right, I think. Anyway, let's now widen out. We've ranged all kinds of things. You know, the principles behind fronting an organisation like Liberty vis-a-vis some of the other considerations that some politicians controversially have made recently, the specifics, and Leveson and freedom of the press. So over to you now. Who would like to begin the wider discussion with a question? Yeah.
First of all, I'd like to commend you highly, Shami. I've been a great fan of what you stand for and what you fight for. But since I've met you in person today and some weeks ago, that level, thermometer, whatever, of respect has gone up. because I also see a very, very sincere person behind, not what, well, you know. And what is very, very alarming, because I've lived in Britain for 43 years, and I always took it very innocently that this was the best country in the world, free, liberal, this and the other. We had rights. You know, you could shout down the phone, for example, if somebody's not doing their job properly, because you know that you can take them to court or whatever the case may be. And I didn't realize that actually what was happening right under, you know, my nose is that the law is in place. Pardon my ignorance, but when you actually describe the law in itself, I thought you were talking about North Korea. I didn't think this was actually a law in Britain.
Well, the secret courts thing hasn't passed yet. It's currently in the House of Lords.
I know, but even for it to be discussed, even for it to be debated, we're talking about Britain. We're not talking about, you know, for it to even have been put forward. I think we are, you know, in that danger zone at ignorance and complacence, and I was certainly ignorant of it. And I'm sure there's a lot of people around who don't know what it is. So I think it is for us to be engaged, you know, and as you said, you should get involved with Liberty. I think I'm going to phone you next week sometime about that. But I think what is very important, and for groups or societies like the Dialect Society, is to make it, you know, available to people, you know, for us to realize how dangerous it is, what kind of law is happening, and for us to, you know, read up and take part and all that. So thank you very much indeed for bringing it to the fore. Thank you.
When you we'll have another question, but when you say that they also, you know, when you were using the analogy, do you want cameras in the bedrooms and the living rooms? But of course we will only use them if we sense the need to. Presumably there are some conditions to access, again, with the emails and all the rest of it.
I mean, if you actually look at this, I should say two things. The secret courts policy is a bill that's going through Parliament at the moment.
Yeah, sure.
So that is really, really urgent. The communications data, what we're calling the Snoopers Charter, with some success thanks to your colleagues in the. You see, I don't have a beef with the press. Where would Liberty be without the? No, we campaign in the, you know. So the press play a really important role. This is why I think people should calm down a bit. But the communications data project is a draft bill, so it's, you know, being consulted on, and it will be scrutinised in advance of actually being, you know. So there's a bit more time. They say they'll, you know, they one of the things that they've done in the draft bill is they've taken a power to do what's called data mining. So what they want to do, what they're going to do is force the commercial companies who currently have access to your web browsing, etc., force them to keep the data for longer than they need to. So under data protection law, they should, if they need it for billing purposes, fine, but beyond that, they should be destroying it. So they're now going to be forced by law, it's like a contracting out of surveillance to the company. They're going to be forced to keep it, and then the bill creates a power to basically do sort of random searching of this data, and keywords and stuff like that, so that potentially you could become a suspect because you've been visiting certain websites. And this is, you know, this is dangerous. People talk about blanket surveillance, whether it's blanket stop and search. There was an infamous power under the Terrorism Act called Section 44. And it's always unintended consequences. Okay, it's often, I always go for sort of cock up rather than conspiracy. I really, really do, as a former civil servant. So Section 44 of the Terrorism Act, we all know that normally you want stop and search to be with suspicion. I suspect that you might be fleeing a crime scene, or you might be going out to make trouble. So I've got reasonable suspicion that you're carrying something or you're behaving oddly. I want to stop and search you. And that should be the paradigm of stop and search in a democracy. I think we'd agree. But at the same time, I'm prepared to concede that there'd be certain places and certain situations where you know, it's the House of Commons, it's Parliament Square on the day of the Queen's speech, it's an airport, where the place itself is so sensitive that it could be proportionate to subject everybody to stop and search. If I go into the House of Commons, I'm going to put my bag through a machine. If I go to the airport, and I don't complain about that. Why don't I complain? Firstly, because I can see that this is proportionate, because this place is a target for wrongdoing, and B, because I don't feel singled out. Because I can see that Steve Richards just went before me, and he's a white man and he's not a protester and his bag was checked. So that means that you can have a blanket. Sometimes a blanket provision will work if it's proportionate. The danger with Section 44 was they allowed stop and search without suspicion in any area designated by a chief constable endorsed by the Home Secretary, and the whole country basically got designated. So in practice, what that meant was everybody was not being subject to stop and search without suspicion every time they left their house. This power was used against young black men and peace protesters. And then something that seems blanket becomes very arbitrary and discriminatory. And this, in my view, is what would happen with this massive honeypot of can you imagine everybody's web browsing habits? They're not going to be looking at everybody's web browsing habits. So you're finding arbitrary ways to single out particular people, and it's a real problem.
Yeah. Okay, let's have another question. Yeah.
Hi, I'm a human rights activist. My name is Amjad. As you can tell from my accent, I'm not British. I was born in Ahwaz, that's South Iran, was occupied by Iran since 1925. However, as you know, on the 14th of June, the European Parliament condemned Iran for oppressing minorities in Iran. In that regard, I just want your recommendation, and also you as a journalist here. Myself, I had 3 little relatives which 3 days ago they were executed in public in Iran. When I start writing to the press, and I myself are called newspapers here, including The Independent, The Guardian, I wrote to them, none of them were interested. I got relatives there, and I came to this country when I was young. Still in this country, I feel no one hears me, no one cares. Thank you.
I'll talk about the media, but do you want to deal with?
Well, I'm aware of the situation in Iran and of how certain people have been treated. I will say that certain British newspapers have run, quite high-profile campaigns. I'm thinking that the Times, in particular, did run quite a big campaign in relation to certain prisoners and so on. I think sometimes the challenge is to, in order to be heard, to find the right allies. Sometimes just as an individual who's just writing, on your own to newspapers or media outlets, it can be a challenge. If you're lucky, you can stumble across the right person who's interested. But I would probably say to you that in your situation you might be better going to Human Rights Watch or Amnesty or a specialist NGO first, because they might be an easier conduit for you to then take your story to the press.
Well, I myself actually wrote to them, and the Human Rights Watch today, they actually did a press release, and so the Amnesty International, but I was surprised by the press, such as the Independent newspaper, the Guardian, the other newspapers, total ignorance.
Well, Amnesty always reports about the situation in Iran, and specifically the Arabs of Ahwaz, and the press don't seem to pick up on it.
They do sometimes. It's not my area. My area is sort of confined to domestic politics, but the advice Shami gives is absolutely the right advice, that the problem with newspapers is they get a lot, even now with the so-called decline of the newspapers, a lot of individuals writing to editors or comment editors, or perhaps in your case it was a foreign affairs editor, with particular appalling stories like the one that you've just described. And because it's, I don't know what form you did it, an email or an individual letter in an envelope. It's literally the practical thing of going through these. They're all understaffed now, and quite often, frankly, I hope this didn't happen in your case. Sometimes they're not read, sometimes they are read and put to one side, and someone will say, well, look at that later. But the whole grammar of newspapers and the BBC, wrongly in some respects, is built around dialogue with institutions rather than individuals. And it's just a practical case that there are a lot of individuals and fewer institutions. And if these
maybe
things
that the internet will over time change all of that, and we'll all be citizen journalists, etc., But and I do think the internet opens up incredibly exciting prospects, as well as certain risks that we have to worry about. Because I think I'm all for blogging and tweeting and citizen journalism, but just as I'm all for first aid, but I also do believe in the power of professional investigative journalism, which would be the equivalent of medicine and surgery as opposed to first aid. But I think I just agree with Steve that it's very frustrating in your position, but I think your best strategy, but that's what I've learned at Liberty. It's not, there's so much injustice in the world, but you have to make common cause, make alliances with the right groups of people to then, and then 100 people is better than one person, and yes, to some extent, institutions, if any, and then finding the best moment and the best way. And sometimes you can just be really unlucky, that it's terrible, but sometimes we have an appetite for one part of the world. We're all interested in Sri Lanka 1 minute, and then our attention is taken to another part of the world, and then we're not interested in what's happening in Sri Lanka anymore, or Iran, or whatever it happens to be. And that's why I think some of these international human rights NGOs can be really valuable.
The other thing as well is, and this is totally arbitrary as well, but the rhythm of the news can help a cause. I mean, if you look back to the Leveson Inquiry and all that's happened since, it all was dependent on the revelation of the Millie Dowler phone hacking, and that captured a much wider scandal. In my view, what was going on in newspapers was a scandal. But they were going to get away with it without that moment. In Iran, there was that moment. It was the stoning of the woman they were going to stone to death and got on the front page. I suspect when that was running as a very big story, if you had then, at that point, said, look, my relative's about to be going through some equally nightmarish ordeal, you would have become, one way or another, your relatives would have become part of the news story. It's a terrible thing, news. It's not scientific. I'm sorry not to be, to say I can get you in the newspaper tomorrow, but that's the reality, really.
But you will find common cause with the right NGOs, I think, because they are, there are people who have desks in place. People like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, they have desks devoted. They have experts who are devoted to that country, and they share your frustration because they're putting these dossiers together day after day after day. But over time, they do achieve things. And if it's not in a British paper, it might be in an American paper. Or it might, because, and in this shrinking interconnected world of ours, so be it. And with the internet, it doesn't really matter, does it, whether it's a British paper or So I feel I understand your frustration, but don't give up, because you will get there.
Next question. Yeah.
First of all, thank you, Shami, for the insights. I have just two comments, actually, regarding the issues that we've been discussing. We had a wonderful discussion with a police officer who had come to our campus in at Leeds Metropolitan University, who came to us to talk about issues surrounding students, university students, and how crimes can be stopped. And at that time, I remember having asked the question what the measures will be regarding, the surfing the internet, and what the police do regarding stopping crimes that happen on the internet. And I was told by the police officer that, of course, we don't, check everyone's internet, those kind of things. And it's appalling that these kind of things now are really seem to be happening. That there's a blanket surveillance.
And
at that time it wasn't of course, very much being discussed. And the second thing I would like to say is that I really think that British media, by and large, is quite biased when it comes to making news about other countries, and I particularly found the recent events in Indonesia being brought up so much, like Lady Gaga, being protested. But there are so many, good things happening in Indonesia. There's a huge feminist movement, and there are Muslim progressive. Orthodox Muslim women, and those things never make it to the news, and we always hear bad things about Indonesia. And I've got to
I
really,
don't think, I mean,
that's really interesting.
To take your second point first, I don't think it's about necessarily bias or even Indonesia. I just think that there is this tendency for bad news to be news, and good news is sometimes less. And I'm not blaming the press for it. Maybe it's a sort of part of the human condition or something that. But again, maybe with the rise of the internet, that will, there will be a more natural equilibrium to that. But yes, let me tell you a story about, feminists in Indonesia, about how things are getting better in the world. Somehow doesn't carry the same currency.
No, although it should do, actually. It's very interesting what you say.
It should be balanced.
And also it is quite interesting. I mean, I don't see why newspapers always have to go for some stereotypical report, and if you delve beneath those, whatever it is that you think presents a very one-sided thing, and discover a big feminist movement. Is it in Indonesia that you said? I think that would be a good piece in an upmarket broadsheet newspaper, and they should do that
sometimes
kind of thing.
Broadcast does the feel-good stuff, doesn't it?
They do.
Particularly in the mornings. Sometimes the sort of breakfast programmes are trying to perhaps ease people into their working lives with a vague smile on their face.
There was a time when the Times and the Independent and the Guardian would devote 1,800 words to that kind of thing. I'm afraid the newspapers are really dumbed down at the moment. I think if they all close, it will be partly because of the rise of the internet, but it will also be down to a massive commercial miscalculation of the broadsheets, which is that they need to head for sort of Daily Mail territory to get an audience. Well, the Daily Mail, by definition, has got that audience. Sorry, this is a more parochial discussion than the feminist movement in Indonesia. But the fact that isn't now reported, whereas I think when the Independent started in the late 1980s, they would have done that story. Actually, you would have gone to the foreign editor, and they would say, "Thanks for that. That was really interesting." I agree with you. It's depressing.
But on your first point about surveillance, online surveillance, I just want to be clear before poor old Steve thinks that I'm just kind of some loony libertarian who's not living in the real world where crime has to be, dealt with. I have no problem with surveillance, or even quite intrusive surveillance, including planting bugs in people's houses, etc., when it's based on individual suspicion of an individual person and it has certain safeguards. I would prefer these things to be signed off by judges rather than politicians, but forgetting that from it, I have no problem with the principle that privacy is not an absolute, and it's a long-established principle of law in this country. If you think that somebody is building bombs in their home, you think somebody's got stolen goods, kidnapped children, whatever it happens to be, you go and get a warrant. If there's time, if there isn't a time, the police can go and bash the door down, and you can even, in my view, perfectly proportionately, subject to safeguards, have warrantry that allows hidden cameras and hidden whatever, even in people's homes. But the point is, you do it on the basis of a threshold of individuated suspicion. What you don't do, because it's lazy and because it's easy and because it's cool technology, we all do it, don't we? You've got various things that you can do on your iPhone, so you start doing them. You can, and therefore you do, without actually thinking about the consequences of the technology. There's all sorts of cool technology. We can store more and more data, so let's just do it, rather than thinking about the ethical principles and the potential dangers. So I've got no problem with targeted surveillance of suspects subject to appropriate safeguards. I have got this problem of the blanket surveillance of a whole population.
Sure. I suppose there would need to be a general law to create the space for the targeting, wouldn't there? I mean, how would
Well,
you
we do
frame
it. Well, we do it with. We've got it. You know, we have it in other areas that you
Yeah.
have with a warrant. You can
Yeah.
tap somebody's telephone.
Yeah.
You can search their property. You
Yeah.
can do all sorts of things. You can arrest them.
Yeah,
So
of course.
what I'm saying is that's the kind of legal and practical architecture that I would like to see employed on the internet.
On
Now,
the
what
internet.
the counter argument will be, oh, but isn't it so much easier if we
Just
can
collect the lot.
collect the lot?
Yeah.
Nothing to hide, nothing to fear. Do you know, it's not true that the innocent have nothing to fear.
Yeah.
Because, Steve, think about it. A politician's web browsing habits.
Oh, absolutely.
And then we see that this politician has been looking at a little bit of pornography or has been going to a gay dating site when they're not out, or has been, I don't know, playing certain games on the internet, talking to people that,
Yeah.
and suddenly you've got a blackmail risk.
Yeah.
Suddenly you've got,
No question. Yeah, absolutely. I can see the dangers, massive dangers. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got a question about social networking sites. Increasingly, because there's been a lot of abuse of by companies such as Facebook abusing personal data. For example, they'll share that data with third-party companies, or they'll store the data long after you've deleted your account. And increasingly, there have been calls for governments to regulate social networking sites. And as a person who's quite ignorant of the consequences, what would be the potential consequences and risks of governments regulating social networking sites?
Well, I don't want governments to regulate social networking sites in terms of interfering with individuals' ability to come together. We can all see the dangers of interfering with the great opportunity which is for individuals in Iran or China or London to come together and share information. We're all for that. What we're not for is for powerful people, whether they are governments or whether they are, frankly, the Facebooks and the Googles, to be intruding on people's privacy and so on. So data protection, the basic proposition, I think, is that the law generally, ethical principles offline and legal principles offline ought to translate online too. Right? If your privacy matters, that's why I use the analogy with your home and your bedroom. If your privacy matters to you in your home and your bedroom, your privacy matters to you online with your web browsing habits as well. If you can think of it in that way. If you are threatening and bullying people in person, and that is a criminal offence, it will also be a criminal offence to threaten and bully people online. So I've got no problem. I'm not trying to suggest that the internet is the Wild West and there should be no ethics and no law there. We don't want governments snooping on the internet or shutting it down, but we do want people to we want two things. We want people to treat each other with the same respect that they do online as they do offline, and we want people to take care of their own privacy. This is part of it. I can sit here and tell you that you need to watch out for governments and you need to watch out for companies who may sell your data without your consent, but we also have to be careful ourselves. We can be silly with our own privacy. And I think younger people need to be brought up. This was, when I was a kid, this stuff just didn't exist. Mobile phones didn't exist, let alone the internet. And there's my son is now 10. There's a whole generation of kids growing up who need to understand that forever is a long time. And you're putting pictures of yourself and your friends online that may come back to haunt you when you're applying to get a university or you're applying to do a job. You think you've sent something just to 500 of your Facebook friends, but you don't know what your friends are doing with that.
I suppose the difference, I'm just playing devil's advocate here, I was just thinking of that thing, you wouldn't allow cameras in a bedroom. I suppose a bedroom is a sort of recognised as a private place. Don't we all go on the internet in the knowledge that it's a public
I don't think we necessarily do. People on
but
Facebook.
Isn't it?
Well, this is
I
the
don't
thing.
know. I'm just supposing.
But you see, this is the debate that needs to be had,
Yeah.
and I can't give you. There isn't an easy answer to
No.
that, because my fear is of young people thinking that it's private when it isn't. That's
Yeah.
if people go into it with open eyes.
Yeah.
then that's fine. My fear is, I just put it on my Facebook, so I thought that it was private. I thought I set my privacy settings, but actually even with my privacy settings, how private are those? So what I'm saying is that it's really going to be so important for younger people in particular to educate themselves and develop a new kind of street smarts about what you put on, because it's, I mean, you'll remember, Steve, in the old days when people were getting upset, you would have had friends 20 or 30 years ago, perhaps they were politicians who would have been upset and they would have said to you, Steve, so-and-so wrote something really unfair about me in the press, and you would have said to them, oh, calm down, and it's chip paper tomorrow. Well, it's not chip paper anymore. And it's the same sort of idea, which is there no right to be forgotten? Is there no right to ever move on with your life? We've got to think about what forever looks like in the world of the world of the internet.
Time for one more question, perhaps. Yeah.
Hi. What I was going to ask is, police crime commissioner is going to become reality not so soon in November. I think the elections are. How do you see yourself? Or your role changing in part in terms of kind of scrutinising, keeping checks and balances and challenging those roles which are going to become, which the hints are at the moment are going to be highly politicised roles, and the fact that they're going to be, there's going to be obviously you guys being based in London and things take place, like I know you guys were relevant on the Birmingham spy camera issue, but other things take place with different forces, and now with the advent of police crime commissioners, how are we going to be empowered to ensure that we are keeping these guys in check, especially considering that it's going to be very politicised indeed?
Good question.
Well, I mean, it'll be no surprise to you that Liberty had and has profound concerns about the policy of elected police and crime commissioners. We talked about the relationship between democracy and the rule of law. I have no problem at all with elected, in fact it's just right in a democracy that elected politicians A, make the laws of the land, and B, run the government, the local government, the central government. But when we get into law enforcement, then I want independent professionals to enforce the law of the land that has been established with an even hand, without fear or favour, without worrying about re-election and so on. And I'm no more comfortable with elected police chiefs than I would be with elected judges. I know they have them in parts of the states, but I don't think that's a great example. And it's all over the internet. You can, at Liberty, campaigned against elected police and crime commissioners. It's not a left-right thing.
No.
There's some people in our democracy and parts of our political establishment who think that the only legitimate power in a democracy is elected power, and if you haven't been elected, you don't have a role to play, and you don't have. And I think it's a real mistake. And I think about an elected police and crime, and sometimes, to be honest, it can be bad enough. And I've been around enough years now to see the temptation of Home Secretaries to start commenting on individual arrests and trials and terror operations. And these are people who've got plenty of other things to worry about. What's it going to be like when you've got a police and crime commissioner who's not also doing border control and all sorts of other, who's only been elected on a ticket that's to do with cutting crime in this local area? And think of all the scenarios. And they put something in the statute about respecting operational independence. But you're an elected politician, and I don't know, there's a gypsy traveller encampment, and the local farmers don't like it. And the police's job is to protect everybody, to protect the property rights of the farmers, but also to protect the gypsy traveller community from being attacked and vilified by the farmers. Right? Will the elected politician always see their role in quite the same way, or will they inevitably, as an elected politician, think about who's voting for them, who did vote for them, who, did take, I could make the nightmare scenario of either BNP candidates winning these elections, or more likely people standing as independents. And this has happened with some mayoralties in the country, people who stand as independents, and you then find out that actually they come from a particular persuasion. I just don't think that this is how the police should be run. But anyway, we are where we are, and you say, well, Liberty's in London, it's going to happen around the country. I can only promise you that my colleagues and I are up and down on the train whenever we need to be, and this is quite a small country. The world is shrinking and interconnected, the country even more so. And we will be there at a local and a national level to say whether we think this is working out and whether we think a particular elected police and crime commissioner is doing what they should do, which is fine. They've got a role in budget setting and scrutiny of the police operation. They should be restrained in that, in my view, and they should not interfere with operational policing.
God, so another role for Liberty from November. Is it November? It's November. Yeah, very important. Yes, yeah. Very important one from November.
Hi. I just want to touch upon the issue of prisoner voting rights. If I understand correctly, both the Conservative and Labour parties have reservations about allowing prisoners the right to vote whilst they're serving their sentence. And given that there's such a wide range of criminals within the prison system, ranging from petty theft to the paedophiles and the murderers, I just want to know what your thoughts are. Should there be a differentiation between those who are have committed hideous crimes to those who haven't, or should there just be a broader view of it should be allowed for all or not allowed for any? And your thoughts, please.
Great question. I think that behind your question there are actually two distinct debates that become conflated. One is a perfectly interesting policy debate. What do we think the policy should be on prisoner voting, right? And you can have that debate in any country in the world. We can have our views on it. And then the second debate is the toxic politics of Britain, Europe, crime, human rights, and the positions that people will take and the emotions that people will vent on this particular policy debate that aren't really to do with the policy. They are to do with the optics and the white noise and the huffing and puffing because it's prisoners and because it's the European Court of Human Rights, etc., etc. To deal with the policy debate first, I'm not an abolitionist. I don't think that all the prisons should be flung open. I tend to think that our prisons are probably too full and there are too many of them. That's, but I have no problem with incarceration of certain criminals. And when I was a law student and we did our sort of legal philosophy jurisprudence lectures, we were taught that there were about 4 traditional justifications in civilised societies for why you might lock somebody up who's committed a crime. And you'll probably know them better than me, but one is straight retribution. You did the crime and there'll be a price to pay, retribution. That's one justification. Another was deterrence. Perhaps if people knew that they would go to prison for certain types of crime, in some cases, it doesn't work for everything, but in some cases they might be less likely to commit the crime. Another obvious one is public protection. Certain people who've been committing certain kinds of crime are just going to do it again, and their crimes are very serious, and so we give them a custodial sentence just to protect people from harm. And then the fourth one, which I think is undervalued, is rehabilitation. That, what if, and it helps not to have overfull prisons, what if some of the people that go to prison could actually be taught to read and write and maybe have a job one day and make it less likely, even if they weren't the most dangerous offenders. These are hapless people who, if they learnt to live in the world in this period in detention, they might have a better life, and that would be good for everybody. So those are the 4 traditional justifications for taking away a convicted criminal's liberty, and I can see some force in each of them, right? What I've never understood is which one of those justifications, retribution, public protection, deterrence and rehabilitation, is served by depriving any prisoner of the vote, any more than depriving them of a book or decent condition. I just don't get it. I mean, are you going to, if I say to you, if you commit a crime that you can't vote, are you going to go, oh, well, in that case, I won't get to vote in the referendum for Scottish independence, oh, you know, perhaps I won't
commit that
I won't
crime.
commit that crime. You know, is that real? Is that are you serious? And so on. Is it really a retribution? Does it really fit the particular crime? I'm not so sure. It certainly doesn't rehabilitate anyone, does it? To say to somebody who's potentially in prison for a few months or a few years, you are dead to us. You are not part of our society anymore. You don't get to participate in debates even about prison conditions, let alone about the NHS and drug policy and all the other things that you actually might have something to say about. I just don't get it. If somebody can, you know, and I've yet to be persuaded by any argument. I've heard great rhetorical arguments like lawbreakers can't be lawmakers and all of that, but I just don't actually understand. I'm all for taking away people's liberty in a proportionate way, but I just want to know what the rational justification is. So that's my argument on the substantive policy, that I personally, we have different, you know, right-thinking people can have different views on this stuff, but I've never quite understood the justification. More than that, I mean, under the last government, you'll know that there was the big debate about identity cards. And, you know, the legislation passed, but then it's been repealed by the new coalition. If that legislation had passed and become entrenched over the years, it's possible that some of us might have been dissenters and might have said, we will not carry an identity card, we will burn our identity cards. And who knows, maybe over time some of us would even have made a decision that we would go to prison in protest. And fair enough, you know, sometimes that's the law of the land, and the price of your conscientious objection is you go to prison. So maybe Chakrabarti's gone to prison because she's burned her identity card. Should she then not be able to vote for a party that says we'll do away with identity card? And okay, I've picked the easiest, most palatable policy, but you know, I just don't get it in terms of democratic theory or in terms of criminal policy theory as to what you're achieving by the voting ban. Now, on the politics of it, whatever Shami's view is, and mine might be a slightly wacky, liberal, libertarian view on prisoner voting, let's remember there wasn't a sensible modern policy debate about this. The blanket ban on prisoner voting was passed in Victorian times in this country. So all this huffing and puffing from Messrs Straw and Davis about the affront to Parliament, this is an affront to Parliament in the 1800s. Right? Because the European Court of Human Rights said that the blanket ban, the unthinking blanket ban on all categories of prisoners voting was a disproportionate interference with voting rights. And instead of having the sensible debate in Parliament about, you know, could we perhaps say that short-term prisoners could have the vote, or should we say that it be up to the sentencing judge, or should we just deprive life prisoners of the, you know, instead of having a kind of sensible policy debate, it's been turned into political posturing and people of both parties saying, let's give two fingers to the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg because we think of the Strasbourg Court of Human Rights as if it's the EU and we want to assert our identity. You know, that's all very well, but if you do that, why shouldn't the Russians do that? And, you know, other newer democracies in the Council of Europe do that too. And if you go down that road, well, I don't think that's a great thing for spreading human rights around the world or in Europe.
Just finally, would you have torn up your identity card?
I'm very glad never to. I'm telling you what, you know, I'm a mother of a 10-year-old child. I'm very glad that you know,
But it would have been, you would have thought about tearing it up.
It would have been a dilemma, but I'm also a mother, and you know, you have to think about all of those sort of personal concerns.
Well, look, Chami, thanks very much indeed for coming along, and thanks to all of you for taking part in the discussion.